Maybe Casey should be reasonable. Casey McDonald. Casey. Well done, casserole, Casey. Casey. Come on, Casey. Don't you ever want to live a little dangerously? Casey. Have you seen Casey? Casey. Little tip for you. Leave Sam alone because he's not interested. Casey. I only asked you out to bug Casey. I care about Casey. Casey. I'm Casey McDonald's stepbrother. Casey. I finished Bob's eulogy. Casey's totally right. Casey's. Cheers to Casey. Casey. And I don't want to do the right thing and tell Casey, but not telling her is making me crazy. Casey. Casey plays with dolls. Casey. Good evening, Casey. Casey's really different, so she wouldn't want to date anybody normal. Casey. And Casey went crazy on me for not breaking up with you. Casey. Hello? Casey McDonald. Casey. Maybe even Casey. But that's just between us, right? Casey. Yes, Casey. Riley? Casey. I don't do this. Casey. Casey McDonald. Casey, when will you learn? I am the exception to all rules. Casey. How could I what? Organize a surprise party for Casey? Casey. Hey, welcome to Casey McDonald's surprise 16th birthday. Casey. Go, Casey. Casey wearing that jacket is nauseating. Casey. Thanks a lot, Casey. Casey and I are cooperating. Casey. I walk in with Amanda, and then Casey's face drops like. Casey. Except for Casey and Derek. Casey.
Derek.
Casey. Why are you trying to set up Casey and Patrick? Casey. I'm just hiding from Casey, and I'm not hiding anything else if that's what you're wondering. Casey planted one on Truman. Casey. Thanks, Case. Casey, kinda who? Future is now, Case. Casey, wait.
What?
Okay, we can't stand each other, right? Casey. Okay, then I will. Thanks, Case. Casey. And this whole thing with Casey's a 24-hour crush. Casey. You loved it, Casey. Casey. Is this about Casey? Casey. Hey, Casey from just as much as I like Casey. Casey. No one should treat Casey that way. I'm driving Casey home. Casey. What's that? Casey? Casey. Casey! Care to discuss car keys, Casey? Case? Hey, Case. And that's okay, Case? Casey. Ah, Casey. Good vacation, Case?
The best.
Yeah?
You?
Better.
Casey. Hey, Casey, is it possible that I am now the together one and you're the problem child? That's super, Casey. Relax, Casey. The kids know to wait by the car. Hey, Case.
Yes, Derek.
I was just thinking, do you still have that guest house in your backyard?
Did Derek just say my name?